Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Kirsten, for that, as well as the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Library. This is my first time being here. I had attempted to come many years ago on another publication I was working on, and so I'm very happy to finally make my way here to Hyde Park, New York, and it's gorgeous up here. So for those who are Franklinophiles or Roosevelt-philes, this is not a Roosevelt book, so you can disabuse yourself of the notion that this is solely about FDR and his administration. This is a very peripheral person to the mammoth African-American personality, Mary McLeod Bethune. So Mary McLeod Bethune is a mammoth figure in the Roosevelt world and universe and the 20th century writ large. And Victorine Quill Adams is in that universe of Bethune and peripherally kind of abuts the Roosevelt. So what I would like to do for you this afternoon is explain to you who Victorine Q. Adams was, the world in which she lived, and how she intersects with Mary McLeod Bethune. And hopefully a little bit about Baltimore. Are there any, Baltimore. Are there any Baltimore natives or affiliates in the audience? As a newly, I see one hand, yes, I want to pronounce it correctly, Baltimore. Thank you, yes. Not too far away, okay. All right, Alexander, okay, excellent. So I just moved to Baltimore from Washington, D.C., and I have to learn to drop the LT. So nevertheless, if you are a native of Baltimore, you would be familiar with possibly Willie Adams. And Willie Adams was the husband of Victorine Adams. I always have to start with the sizzle and then go into the steak. So Willie Adams is a neo-native of Baltimore. He moved from North Carolina in the 1930s from Carolina to Baltimore. And in the midst of his moving, he finds this woman who's very attractive, and they eventually have a kind of romance. They get married. They have a 70-year marriage, Willie and Victorine. Now, what Willie did for work is very interesting. He was a numbers runner. And we're all familiar with the numbers running, which is pretty much the proto-lottery system that many ethnic communities did to galvanize money in their neighborhoods. So there was Jewish, Polish, Russian Jew, European Jew, Irish, Italian numbers runners. The African-American numbers runners in Baltimore were a very unusual crowd, kind of brass knuckles and rather toughs. So what Willie Adams did, who was a polymath, a self-taught individual, who had a photographic memory and a proclivity for figures, he would take his bicycle and go outside of the established black communities so not to run afoul of that syndicate and start his own numbers running business. By the time he dies in his 90s, he's worth millions of dollars. Others had gone to jail, people had been wiretapped, had gone to jail. He himself never saw a jail cell. And interestingly enough, he's married to Victorine Adams, which is the kind of other side of the coin. A Catholic, native-born Baltimorean, educator, very prim, proper, demure, petite, lovely woman. So between the two of them, they're like a Disney kind of fairy tale. And they stayed married for 70 years, and I'm going to start with the quote that she gave in the early part of her life when in 1971, so that kind of sets the stage a bit. So in 1971, on December 25th, she says to the Afro-American newspaper, which is one of the oldest black presses in the country, "I am the wife of Willie Adams, and his former status has been chronicled and presented for years and years. For fear that some uninformed people may think that I occupy my city council seat, and only because I am the wife of Willie Adams, I offer the following explanation. Whereas I'm well known as the wife of Willie Adams, I'm better known in my community as a diligent, hardworking civic worker and civic leader in my own right. I want to remind some and inform others that I carved a niche in Baltimore for myself with my teaching techniques by sheer dint of my hard work. My husband's encouragement and financial support were not handicaps, but I did the purposing, the planning, and saw to the execution of the many projects. I have paid my dues to Baltimore. I feel I should be regarded not only as the wife of Willie Adams, but as a woman who has used her influence and affluence to better the community in which she lives." So this particular book that I wrote comes out of that quote, that she is going to come and be extracted from the shadows of her husband's very imposing figure. She was born in 1912, April 28th, at Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is an interesting place to be born as an African American, because Johns Hopkins Hospital did have a racial policy in place that was de jure. It wasn't written in the stone, but it was understood that the world operated in parallel universe, one colored and one white. But nevertheless, she's born there to her parents, who were married, Her mother was a neonative. She came from the Eastern Shore, and her father was a native Baltimorean. She was one of 2 children born to that union. She had a brother, and over the course of her childhood, they really stressed the importance of education. She was educated in all of the, quote, segregated school systems of the time, and interestingly enough, she eventually becomes a school teacher. During the first half of the 20th century, women in general, and African American women in particular, were relatively conscribed to 4 pink-collar professions: nursing, teaching, social work, and librarianship. So these were the kind of stellar superhero positions for African American women to aspire to. In Baltimore City, what the state did as well was create Coppin Normal School for African American women to obtain their teaching certification. So she did not go to College Park, University of Maryland College Park. She went over to West Baltimore to Coppin Normal School. Coppin Normal School is now Coppin State University. And as a result, a number of African Americans, women in particular from that era, had to go to the normal school to receive their teaching certification. So she goes to Coppin Normal School to obtain her teaching certification. Then she eventually goes to Morgan College, which is now Morgan State University. At Morgan State University, or Morgan College at the time, she obtains a BS degree in education, and then she goes into the public school system in the 1940s. In Maryland in particular, in the 1940s, where we have the intersection of what will be the FDR administrational realm, is that the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. We know that gave women the right to vote. Maryland, like many other states, sought to nullify that. So they did not ratify that constitutional amendment till 1941. So even though women had the right to vote on the books, the state of Maryland kind of obfuscated the law by just simply refusing to ratify that. It won't be till 1958 when that ratification is then fully accepted. So Maryland, as much as a blue-thinking and blue-leaning state, really has a very red heart in terms of some of its policies during the segregation era. So what Victorine Adams does do is she leaves the classroom by the 1940s, and then she's going to basically take her teaching profession and in 1946 establish the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. And the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee is going to seek to have African American women learn about the power of the ballot, to learn about voting. And I'll eventually dial back to where Mrs. Bethune and her get together in the 1930s. But I think it's very important when we look at who FDR was and his effort to kind of democratize the American democracy for all citizens. It's important to understand how African American women in Baltimore City and Maryland at large were experiencing this, quote, era of democracy. She actually purchases a machine, a voting machine, which we have in our collection, so people could engage the machine so there would be no confusion when they went into the ballot box or the ballot booth. So she was very intentional about this in empowering women. At the same time, if we roll back to the earlier part of the century, in 1910, there was an effort on the books to nullify the vote of African American men. So those pink-collar women, the teachers, get into the community and tell the African American men, regardless of what happens, you need to vote, because they're going to take your vote away. So the whole idea of education and the ballot are the twins that really blossom out of the Reconstruction and early first half of the 20th century for African Americans. So Victorine, born in 1912, is going to be inculcated with this idea of stewardship in regards to education and civic engagement with the ballot. So she grows up, she goes to these schools. What is of interest is that she does meet her husband. He is doing his thing at the same time she is doing her thing. So the book discusses her Catholic relationships as well. She was a very staunch Catholic, and even the Catholic Church itself was also segregated. So she belonged to St. Peter Claver Church, which is one of the oldest of the 2 in Baltimore City. And as a result, she's very involved with that. So she's not just using education or using the idea of stewardship, she's also infused with a Christian mission of the Catholic Church to bring light to those places that are dark within the city and to speak for those who are unable to speak. As an educator, we have to kind of look at her career because she understands that education is very key. African American school teachers in particular didn't just simply use the classroom. They saw it as a full court press, that your whole person needed to be recreation, education, morals, as well as socialization. So at the same time she's doing her classroom work eventually going to go into civic activity with the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. She's going to add a charm school. And I wish I had been born in that era, because I don't know what fork to use or how to put a napkin across my lap, all of these dainty things. So her husband's going to buy her on what is Pennsylvania Avenue, which is considered the Black Broadway of Baltimore City, a dress shop. It's called the Charm Center. And I had the pleasure of meeting someone who went in there to buy a debutante dress, I guess in the 50s, and she said it was like you had to go behind the waterfall. You didn't just go in. You had to be invited in. This is she's in her 70s, reflecting on her 15-year-old self. And she said the shag on the rug was so deep, and it was just an experience for her. So the Charm Center actually held competitions to train young women on what clothing to wear, what undergarments to wear, and how to comport themselves as African American women. And those things were going to be very much read of people, because they didn't just see you, they saw all of you. In terms of the mythology that the newspapers had, we call stereotypes, or other aspects of yourself. So her intentions were not just simply to get your mind educated, but to have you socially and civically educated to what you represent when you're in certain spaces. So with the idea of the Charm Center School, she's going to comport the young women to understand what kinds of makeup to wear, what kinds of hairstyles to wear. And she's going to also use these kinds of what we would call enablements with the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee when she explicitly tells them how to go to city council meetings, how to dress, and how to take inventory or to take a reconnaissance. So let me just read here about the school marms, which is another one of her groups. So there were always all of these groups they had. So the school marms were a bunch of school teachers who were kind of cultivating and selecting who they wanted to kind of continue to cultivate. The teaching experience for Victorine included the school marms. The school marms often traveled together, and according to the Afro, they held jovial events where they did, quote, big romps on a big scale. It was in the evenings for fun and games with crayon drawing, pictures, lollipops, ice cream cones, battles. Guests wore rompers, frilled knee socks, and baby dresses. These kid parties were often clean fun. The women kept one another company in some states because marriage bars prevented school teachers from getting married. One married, women were asked to leave once married. The school bar implied that women could not teach and maintain a full-time job teaching and have household principals as well. So Victorine worked at school number 112, and the principal was George B. Murphy, and the vice principal was Estelle W. Lee. Victorine remained in contact with Estella and returned to celebrate her retirement in 1958 at the age of 81. So in the midst of these school romps and the school marms, black women are using these club experiences for other kinds of conversation. So we would call that kind of dissemblance. So you think they're just simply having a party and eating ice cream. There's lots of civic activity and kind of reconnaissance and conversation going on back and forth between the women. So for teaching in Baltimore City, they are the vanguard of the civil rights movement. And they're going to raise their bar in 1943 to form the Baltimore section of the NCNW. Now, the National Council of Negro Women is Mrs. Bethune's organization. Mrs. Bethune, as you very well know, was very much involved with the Roosevelt administration, but she herself also kind of came through the ranks of school teacher and being encouraged to realize that even though her desire to be a missionary to West Africa was thwarted by the Presbyterian Church, Lucy Craft Laney, friend and mentor, said, "Your missions field are our people in education." So Mrs. Bethune is going to use that and take that very seriously to use education and the network of African American school teachers to basically use this as a ladder to elevate and to educate. Mrs. Bethune and Mrs. Victorine are in conversation because she's the corresponding secretary for the Baltimore section of the NCNW. And they're going to be very much involved in World War II and concerning themselves with equity for African American men, servicemen in particular. We know that Mrs. Bethune had a kind of double-pronged focus, the servicemen, but also the women, and getting women into the Corps, the auxiliary corps and other spaces where women could function. And they did that very well. In the midst of this, she gets invited to Baltimore, Mrs. Bethune, to talk to the Baltimore section and to really kind of be present in the space. Because in the midst of it, Baltimore is also shifting. It is going to go from an industrial town where working class people with little to no skill could make a decent job at Sparrows Point or Bethlehem Steel. Those companies are going to slowly pull up their stakes and leave the city. That's going to bottom out the city. And what we're dealing with now in Baltimore, if you look at the news and you see some of the violence and the crime, it really stems from that era. Because working class people were not retooled into the employment that they would be able to have post-industrial. And then the education as well was not going to step in line with what the technology needed. So this is that kind of bridge period between the successful Baltimore that people knew pre-World War II into what is now kind of the hobbling along, very economically stratified Baltimore that we're seeing right now. So Victorine is going to also throw herself into politics and try to ameliorate the conditions of poverty in the city. Now what happens is that her mother, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but it's kind of a interesting, it'll make sense where I'm going in time. I hope it makes sense to you. So when she starts her Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, her mother is just horrified that she would affiliate anything with the Democratic Party. And as one of the other speakers said, that African Americans are principally Republican prior to, her family were staunch Republicans of Lincoln's party. And so when she says, mother, it's not the party, it's the ideal of democracy. And they're going to actually support their first political effort. It's going to support a Republican candidate who's going to run, and they're going to support him because he's going to run as a Republican in Baltimore because of the fact that the state was rather partisan. And let me see if I can find his name here. And they successfully get him in office. But also, Harry Cole was the first African American to hold a state senatorship in Maryland. He's going to be a Morganite. He's going to be a member of one of the fraternities, and he's going to be supported by the Morgan community and the African American community. Just like Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, there were political bosses in Baltimore. And Melnikov was supported by a man named Polak. And Mr. Polak already had chosen who he knew the candidate was going to be and who was going to win. So this Cole situation totally disrupted his plan for the state. So then there's going to be some war in the newspapers about the vote and who won, but Cole is eventually going to win. Cole's first piece of legislation is going to attack Jim Crow at the heart. Punitive damages be assessed to the institution or business discriminating on the lines of race. So $50 to $100 fine for those who choose to violate what? The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. That is going to make Cole a one-term candidate. Because the Republicans are going to join the Democrats and say, you're moving too fast. This is way too fast. And we have to move slow. And you can't hit pockets, because Ocean City and other places that are resort, that's their bread and butter. So when we see the idea of Democratic and Republican parties in Baltimore City, which pretty much was the bellwether for the state up until, I guess, the last 30 years, because now Prince George's County is the stronger area, they could really determine the way of the state. So the idea of being governor in Baltimore, Maryland, you have to go city council chair, mayor, then eventually you get to be governor. So that whole entire trajectory, Mr. Polak and other political bosses had in line and locked up. So Miss Quill Adams is going to disrupt that narrative with her women. And as a result of disrupting the narrative and getting African American women vocally and involved in voting, in conversation and partnership with black men, it's going to totally disrupt the state. She's going to remain an independent, but her relationship is going to swing like a pendulum. As Mrs. Bethune did, she told FDR himself, I'm not in your pocket. I'm going to go for the policies that benefit my people. Now, Mrs. Bethune is going to infuse the minds of Baltimore voters right kind of in that DMV area on how they need to move the state of Maryland. And Maryland has a very powerful presence in terms of its legislature as well as its visible impact with the African American community. So as a result of this legislation and the idea that Mrs. Adams is going to help with that idea that we need to be loose and fast to move according to policy, not party. That's going to now bring in white women as well to now join, because they're also going to be oppressed in some legislation as well. So as a result, you now have a whole contingent of women who are very galvanized, and they're not just women for themselves. They're going to be able to turn husbands' heads, and then also they're going to influence their children. So women really do hold the lion's share of how the body politic is going to move. So in 1958, she creates the Women United Party, and that group is going to also now become looking for candidates. So we've just moved from the idea of colored women and teaching you how to vote. We're now going to start to identify and support, Emily's List level support, women we think would be good to run. And they're going to get behind one woman in particular, Verda Welcome, and Verda Welcome is going to be the first African-American woman who is going to be elected to the state Senate in the state of Maryland. And she's going to help with the legislation to move Morgan College to Morgan State University. She's also going to look at the idea of equity in terms of marriage. There were interracial marriage bans. She's going to deal with that. She's going to also deal with the idea of the fair play in terms of the minimum wage. So once again, when Verda Welcome gets to the state Senate level, the whole idea is legislating policy that benefits all citizens. It's not about race. It's about equity for humanity. So what Mrs. Adams does do is she also runs for the state Senate. She's elected to the state Senate in 1966, but then she eventually extracts herself and runs for city council, because there were 2 other black women on the state level at the time, and she said there's no one in the city. So if all of our concentration's on the state level, who's thinking of the city? So she's going to run for the city council, and I'm sure the shadow behind her, her great husband, from what I understand, had mighty influence, did kind of escort her into that position. But she did have to have an agenda and a platform, and she had to articulate that. So she wasn't just simply a figurehead. So in 1967, she's elected the first African-American woman to hold a city council seat, which she holds for 4 terms in the city of Baltimore to 1983 when she retires. In the midst of this, what she's going to do is to fight for citizens in Baltimore City who are going to be unemployed or underemployed because a lot of companies are leaving. People want to work. They didn't want a check. They want a job and they want to earn a pay. And that, once again, transcends race. Baltimore, as long as race, is also along class lines as well. And so some parts of southern Baltimore, even though they're bifurcated by race, they're more unified by class, or the lack thereof in terms of money. So as a result, all of these divisions and all of these balkanized spaces, she saw those who had and those who didn't have. And those who didn't have didn't want a handout. They wanted to be able to pull their own weight at their capacity. So she's going to come against that. So one of her greatest pieces of legislation, almost modeled along the idea of the efforts that Roosevelt did, was the Baltimore Fuel Fund. In 1978, those of us remember there was a blizzard on the East Coast that paralyzed the entire East Coast. And I talked to one group of students who didn't know this, but we didn't have teleworking or teleschool or whatever. Snow days were real. Those were the real snow days. I think we were out of school in Massachusetts for a week. And what happened in Baltimore City is people's fuel was cut off because of arrears. People were in arrears of a minimum of $200, so they cut off their heat. So people used alternative sources to heat their units and led to fires. So there were several deaths in the city of Baltimore that, once again, took this passionate Catholic woman. She was grieved greatly by this. So she creates the Baltimore Fuel Fund, which was a public-private partnership to be able to supplement people who owed money. By now, it's against the law to do that. But nevertheless, that was one of her pieces of legislation that really endeared her to the people, and it still goes on now. I believe a number of 20 states pick up this idea of a fuel fund to help people subsidize their bills. So as a result, her compassion and her legislation really drove her to kind of model after Bethune and to some extent FDR in being the voice for the voiceless. Like she said, her affluence and her influence were things that did not hinder her, but actually impelled her to do. And towards the end of her life, what she sought to do was to deal with education and the whole idea of the public school education. Mayor Kirk Schmoke in the early 1980s, along with Victorine Adams, sought to really retool the curriculum in the city to make it relevant for the jobs that were coming. As we know, technology needs less people. So as a result, we need people who are skilled to do work, but then people who don't have the skill also need to find something to do. So there's a Mondawmin Mall in West Baltimore. Her husband was very instrumental in creating. I believe it's one of the first malls of its type. And so people could actually open businesses there to apprentice young people in that space. So her vision was always forward-thinking as an educator, but also principled in terms of the fact that everyone is not equally skilled, but everyone is equal in terms of their capacity to pull for themselves. And that's the kind of legislation she sought to do. So in regards to her work as a school teacher, the voting rights education, partnering with the public and the private to create a fund for people, running for city council, and taking care of legislative matters, she really saw herself as an agent for the people. And I believe that that's very parallel to what Bethune and Roosevelt had done, as well as Mrs. Roosevelt. So I'm going to stop right now and take some questions from you, because I can go on and it's kind of all over the place, but I hope it made some sense to kind of introduce you to a woman who I found to be very fascinating, and hopefully you found her equally fascinating as well. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
So In the 60s, when she's attempting to, or she's organizing politically, is the Baltimore Democratic Party at all liberal, what we would call today liberal or progressive, or is it kind of a Southern Democratic, very, very resistant to any black influence?
Is the party she established, the Baltimore Democratic Party, liberal or conservative? To some extent, I'm just repeating for the camera. So her party was nonpartisan, so it didn't take a particular stance. The idea of democracy, as she told her mother, who was horrified that she would use that word, was the idea of democracy in terms of the principle that everyone should have an equal vote and an equal say, and the majority of that equal vote and equal say carry out. So it was not a matter of being partisan, but she does get behind LBJ. She actually does lead the state. Her and her husband, there's a picture in the book where they attended one of LBJ's parties. So she does kind of lean towards the national agendas that are going to address concerns that the urban center was needing answer to.
When she was on the city council, wasn't at the time Spiro Agnew was governor of Maryland, and what kind of interference or obstruction did she get at the state level?
Yeah. The beautiful thing is that we had Verda Welcome at that level, so he could snipe. He was sniping, but she was able to deflect because he was very much anti the city. He was very vocal about that in a very truculent fashion. And so as a result, she was able to use probably her husband's influence to kind of keep him at bay. But people were very much anti-Baltimore City for some reason. I can think majority black city. And once again, there were wealthy people there in the city as well. But she was able to deflect him. There's a couple of mentions about him, but I know his end was not the greatest, Spiro Agnew, so he kind of pitters away. But also her husband made a very strong alliance with Russian Jewish communities as well. So even though they were African American, they were able to align themselves with the Russian Jewish community, who were very much entrenched in various levels of politics and had a slight war against the European Jews, which is interesting. I'm still trying to understand the dynamics there. But she was very clear on what she was doing, and he did make efforts. He was very vocal about it, but they just kind of slid down the wall. They didn't stick. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that question.
I particularly loved how you talked about the charm school, which you can imagine being dismissed as being a politicized space that becomes really important. But it did make me wonder what her reaction was by the time you get to the 1960s to the rise of Black power politics and Black nationalism, which does become really important in cities like Baltimore. Did she, make her peace with that? Were there any internal struggles that you saw in the papers around that issue?
That's a very good question. What was her reaction to the Black Power movement? She was not for that because it was a level of impoliteness to that, I guess you could say. And I guess that generation, it's more generational, that they were going to be loud and they were going to be heard. And some of that behavior was a bit impolite, but she understood where it came from. So as a result, she herself did not openly embrace, nor did she openly discourage. But she was very clear to maintain her sense of decorum and her sense of what a race woman was. Because you're saying the same thing, just at different volumes. And so as a result, she did not impede them. She actually does come back to Morgan State, where there was a man by the name of Dr. Fleming, who was doing political grassroots activity and teaching political science, to come and tell the young people how to politicize, how to organize yourselves, and be taken seriously. Because yelling and screaming and doing other things like that get attention, but it doesn't move the needle. So don't dismiss that, but then now organize yourselves to be able to be invited inside and lay your issues out line by line. So a man, Kwesi Nfume, was a young man at the time who was at Morgan State, who eventually goes into politics, and there's a number of other, Judge Bell, Robert Bell, who's also in Maryland as well. They were all students of her in that grassroots school that would happen at Morgan State. So they didn't lay down their afros or their afro picks or their picket signs, but they were able to galvanize that energy and then marry that with being invited inside to articulate their agendas. And that's another piece of this I'm trying to unpack as well in terms of that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Did Benjamin Quarles get involved at all with this local politics from his position in Morgan State? Or did he stay above it?
Did Benjamin Quarles involve himself? He was very much involved. I'm actually going to be talking to WJZ-TV on the March on Washington for their anniversary. And he, as well as Fleming and others, attended the March on Washington. And one of the students actually told me, I don't think it was a Quarles student, but they were told they needed to participate. So she said, I hold the placard in front of my face, I failed the class if I didn't show up at the protest at Northwood Shopping Center. So around the campus of Morgan, it's in the Laurelville community, which was very gentrified or segregated at the time. And so Morgan was kind of this little black oasis in this white sea of the county. And as a result, Northwood Shopping Center was a Jim Crow space. Once again, de jure, America, 1950s. So they protested, the students protested, and they were able to get those places to kind of integrate, and then eventually they closed their doors, which is very interesting. They're now reopened. So we actually have the new revitalized Northwood Shopping Center in Baltimore City. So our academic faculty, under the presidential administration of Dr. Jenkins, who openly had to be nonpartisan because of the funding, the students took his silence as a green light. And I've had a number of students from the classes of the 50s and the 60s tell me, when he kind of said, don't do this, they read like, yeah, do it hard. You know, so as every 17-year-old mind says, right? And then you have Victorine Adams coming back and her husband's numbers runner. Now the money people are coming back saying, well, do it this way. So everyone, they're hearing, yes, yes. And so they galvanize and they move. But then there's also those students who understand that it's two levels of conversation. You can have this attention getting, but you also need to have this intellectual agenda and be able to turn the volume down and talk and listen so you can actually move the needle. So that's happening in Quarles' class with his teaching about history. So you're seeing that's happened before 50, 100, 200 years ago. So clearly it's not a person you're dealing with. It's a system. So how do you identify the system, reconstruct the system, and then work within that system? So he's involved there to some extent, very much so. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, sir. Are you from Baltimore?
No.
I see you two in the pic, yeah.
I'm just wondering, what happened to Mayor Schmo's efforts to retool the curriculum?
It slid down the wall. It did not get the kind of momentum he was looking for. And there's actually a number of educators who were doing it in their individual classrooms, but curriculum writ large across the city did not intend to do that. And that was, I think, one of the greatest pains for her, because what she saw was great potential. So then you have these squeegee boys that are out there kind of doing windshield wiping. They have great business models, but the wrong business. And then by the time you get smoke in there, crack is slowly coming into these urban centers. So once again, great business models, wrong product. And so I believe it's, oh goodness, I think it's not McNally, I have to find his name. Oh goodness, it's escaping me right now, but the whole idea of criminalizing, profiting off the criminalization of people is what's going to be the next level. So as a result, don't fix it, just profit off of the criminality of people. And so that becomes the next issue. So then we have yet to get a mayor in the city that can say, okay, I think this guy is trying to do it now, the current mayor, Brandon Scott, let's find another way to redirect this energy. So now they've banned, and for those who don't know, squeegee boys are these young boys between the ages of pubescence to mid to late teenagers who will meet you at an intersection and kind of want to wash your windshield. Some with all kinds of solvents that either smear or distort your windshield. But they're trying to make money, and some of them are not as aggressive, some are aggressive. As of last summer, one young man shot and killed somebody who told him, don't touch my car. And the man came back again, and it was an altercation, he shot and killed him. He's 14, the assailant, the man is 50 plus with 4 children, he's dead. So now we have an issue, because it's in that area downtown by the Inner Harbor, which is a moneymaker that Schaefer started. So once again, you're hitting the pocket of the city. So now there's two camps about this. People have always been complaining about these people, and people are saying, well, this is what kids have always done. This is the urban lemonade stand. So how do you reconcile this? But if you look at the long history of 40, 50 years of undereducating, underemploying, what do you think they're going to do to make money? So as a result, we're at a stalemate here because the father of the assailant said the child has been doing this since he's 7. Well, shouldn't he be in school or something? I mean, there's something wrong with this, but there's also something wrong with the fact that he murdered somebody. So that's currently the new situation. But Brandon Scott, the current mayor, is right now seeking to find a way to retool them, and they're doing trash pickup or something along those lines where they can make some monies to do something beneficial. So once again, the education is what's missing. And that's the biggest thing. And if that had happened the way it should have, we probably would not have had this underbelly as gross as it is. But unfortunately, it's a gross situation in the city. Yes?
Did our efforts extend to other parts of the state, such as the Washington suburbs or the Eastern Shore?
Very good question. Did Victorine's efforts extend to the Eastern Shore or the lower part of the state? Not to my knowledge, but I know that the National Council of Negro Women have agencies in those areas, so it could be a very peripheral connection. The lower part, Prince George's County is very wealthy, but they're now sliding as well in terms of education. So once again, these educational outcomes really do kind of project the criminal activities in a particular locale. So once again, if we find people undereducated, they're going to turn to what we call underground economy and other kinds of means to survive, which unfortunately do lead to violence and death. So the whole intention is to kind of pull this before it goes over the edge, pull it before it gets to the brink. And for some reason, some people make money when it's over the brink. So we're kind of wrestling with this idea morally and monetarily, and the money people are tending to win because they see dollars and all of that. But as far as the Eastern Shore, they're a bastion unto themselves. Morgan State has done a great deal to reach out. A number of our student population come from the Eastern Shore. And the Eastern Shore, for those who don't know, is this kind of slight isolated community by that Bay Bridge that has kind of been its own kind of ecosystem for centuries. And once again, the industry of offshore farming of clams and water-faring activities has kind of dipped a bit. So they're trying to find other ways to make money. Tourism is the new thing. So the Harriet Tubman facility and the National Park Service is out there trying to bring tourism dollars out there and kind of go from Douglas to Tubman and kind of go up the waterways. So once again, everything is now shifting, and education is the underpinning here, because we do have an oceanography element at Morgan. Is actually an initiative, too, to kind of go out there and do things with our students who are doing this kind of work in theory, be in live spaces to actually execute the work. So I know she herself didn't do it, but you can see efforts of other individuals trying to resuscitate that space to the best of their ability. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you talk, first off, thanks for a great talk. This is Could you talk more about the relationship with Bethune? Because she seems like she kind of fulfills Bethune's vision for Black womanhood, but also, you have to listen a lot of attention towards the end of Bethune's life within the organization, within the National Council of Negro Women. So, could you talk more about that?
Yeah, yes, I can to some extent. Of course, we know that Dr. Watts is the authority on Mary McLeod, so I'm not going to try to best her in this regard, but I do appreciate the local narrative of this. And I think because of the fact that Victorine is so enamored with her, she's a celebrity. And the fact that this woman could actually come and sit down and kind of share ideas and thoughts is huge. So I think she took it very much to heart. She's an educator, I'm an educator. You know, you're an African American, I'm an African American. Now, she did not have immediate enslaved parentage like Bethune did, but I think she saw her faith as a Christian is very parallel to her idea that you're impelled by this greater divinity to do good, to be the good, you know, and then of course to kind of be in the space to make it happen. If you can't call those who are legislating into accountability, you get elected, you run, and you become the elected person. Because Bethune did say towards the end of her life, if she could live it over again, she would go to New York and run for Congress. So she would have been a congresswoman here in New York City, way before Shirley Chisholm and others. So that was her intention. If I can't change the policy by just asking or voting, then I will now become the policy maker. And so one of the women actually, and I'll get back to this, is Mikulski. Senator Mikulski was influenced by Victorine Adams. And she was very instrumental in helping her get in the Hall of Fame. Because she's like, she's not in the Hall of Fame? How did that happen? What can I do? As you know, Senator Mikulski. And so she wrote a very lovely letter and said, she taught me how to be a woman legislator. I was able to model my career after her way of being female in a space, a person of ethnic and faith in a space, because she's a Polish Catholic, to do this kind of thing and not have to apologize for being female, ethnic, and a fake person of faith. So she said she modeled that for her. So, yeah. Yeah, and so I think the same way that she gleaned from Bethune, Victorine, is the same way that Mikulski gleaned from her. And so you see this kind of tradition of women inspiring women in a way that sometimes just your presence alone, and then sometimes a word of encouragement, because there are letters in the collection from Bethune to Victorine. I guess, are we at time?
I think we are.
Okay.